Thank you so much for joining, everyone, and welcome to this event on the use of biometrics in the context of counterterrorism, hosted by the European Center for Not-for-Profit Law, International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, Privacy International, Human Rights Watch, and Article 19. My name is Marlena Wozniak, and I work on digital rights with a focus on emerging technologies at ECNL. I'm incredibly honored and grateful to be today here with you all in the context of the second week of UN Office for Counterterrorism. And the goal today is really to discuss how we can best promote and uphold human rights in this space, as the use of biometric is really expanding quickly at the UN, even more so with the global counterterrorism strategy that is set to come out any day now. And emerging technologies, specifically biometrics, are a critical component of the strategy expansion. And today we'll be discussing about technologies related to automation, AI systems such as facial analysis, including facial recognition and emotion recognition. And this is even more important as we live in an unprecedented era of pandemic, where member states have been using the coronavirus pandemic to expand new security legislations, increase powers, and that has really been done by expanding surveillance technologies and biometrics to carry out these measures. So we're really seeing more centralized, interoperable databases of biometric data, and that includes things like fingerprints, DNA, and facial images. And what we're here to discuss today, as I believe is the only civil society-led event of the conference, is really how these technologies impact human rights and civic space. And we all know that civil society is often the first to sound the alarm on some of the harmful impacts or human rights abuses of these technologies in the context of counterterrorism, while at the same time being disproportionately targeted by the misuse of counterterrorism measures. And unfortunately, as always, marginalized and vulnerable groups are disproportionately at risk. So today we have a heavy agenda in only 60 minutes, but hopefully it'll be interesting and dynamic, and you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. We'll start off with welcoming remarks from Mr. Bernd Heinze, who is the head of division for international cooperation against terrorism from Federal Foreign Office of Germany. Then we'll have a fireside chat conversation between three of my esteemed colleagues, Mr. Tommaso Falchetta, Global Policy Lead of Privacy International, Ms. Maya Wang, Senior China Researcher of Human Rights Watch, and Mr. Paulo José Lara, Head of Digital Rights at Article 19 Brazil. And last but not least, Professor Fionnuala Ni Aolain will close us off with closing remarks. And thank you all for being here, really grateful. So let's start immediately. And Mr. Heinze, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marlena. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, dear friends and participants. It's a great honor to deliver some opening remarks on behalf of the German Federal Foreign Office at the beginning of this wonderful event. The subject of this event, Upholding Human Rights in Regulation and Use of Biometrics Technology in Counterterrorism Law and Practice, quite long, that couldn't be more relevant and topical. I assume that the majority of today's participants are traveling, and there is not a pandemic prohibiting it, of course, with a biometric passport. Having documents as forgery-proof as possible is essential for national safety, but also beyond. For instance, to be sure who is boarding a plane that has 400 or 500 other people on board who want a safe flight. In the context of counterterrorism, these considerations are also important. The use of data from such a passport and the corresponding technology allow us to prevent terrorists from traveling. This is, of course, only the security perspective on this issue. But this very clearly is not the only one, and certainly not the perspective that outweighs all others. Germany has reiterated on many occasions that the protection of human rights must be the basis for all our counterterrorism efforts. Not only because this is our international obligation, but because CT measures can never be sustainably successful if they, and also the governmental actors applying them, create new grievances that terrorists can capitalize on. This holds true not only for the analog world, but equally for the virtual one, the world of data that is elusive for many people. The human rights that all individuals enjoy offline also apply online, and irrespective of the technology applied. This basic truth becomes even more evident and its implications more urgent when, due to the pandemic, we all spend most of our days and nights in front of a screen. In order to promote the protection of human rights in the digital age, and especially the right to privacy, Germany, together with partners, presents a resolution on the right to privacy in the digital age in the UN Human Rights Council and in the Third Committee of the General Assembly. The right to privacy is a prerequisite for the meaningful exercise of other rights, granting people the security and confidence to connect with others and to access information. It ensures a secure space, both online and offline. This space is central for civil society and human rights defenders. We are very concerned to see how, in some contexts, security concerns are used as a pretext for serious human rights violations, including the right to privacy, and how principles on the use of personal data are being neglected. Of course, applying the existing binding framework of human rights to new technologies poses specific questions and challenges. Therefore, we need additional rules to adequately address the specific risks and opportunities. When new regulations are drafted, lawmakers must base the exercise on the principles of international human rights law, legality, non-arbitrariness, necessity, and proportionality. When processing biometric data, German authorities are bound by strict data protection regulations. Biometric data are particularly protected as special categories of such personal data. Their processing is only permitted if this is absolutely necessary for the fulfillment of official tasks. Apart from this, appropriate measures must be taken to protect the legal interests of the persons concerned. In all this, equally to our joint counterterrorism efforts, we need an international multi-stakeholder approach. Civil society, academia, and private sector provide essential advice and are important for these discussions. We are convinced that in order to build trust in new technologies, governments, societies, and economies need clear accountability and transparency rules. I look forward to the discussion in how to best achieve this, and I would like to thank all panelists for taking their time and sharing their views and insights on this very important and interesting topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Heinze, and for sharing those concerns and and the role of Germany in helping us uphold and promote human rights. And with those welcoming remarks, we'll move on to the fireside chat to discuss some of the questions at stake today. And I think it'd be great to start with maybe a high-level question that I'd love to hear from maybe Maya, as she is in China today, on what are to you some of the most pressing human rights concerns related to the use of biometrics for counterterrorism. And I just wanted to note that panel attendees today can put questions in the Q&A function in the lower right corner of the Zoom, and we'll do our best to respond to at least some of them But yeah, and so Maya, if you could start us off with some of the key concerns that you see from a human rights angle.
Thank you, Marlena. I would just correct by saying that I'm not in China. I wouldn't be able to speak about these issues if I were in China. I think that's an important example. So I would just start by saying that, I mean, obviously I work in China, and the Chinese government have been using mass surveillance systems that are in large part based on the mass collection of biometrics, but also beyond, to monitor people's relationships and movements, particularly in the region of Xinjiang, monitoring the ethnic minority of Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims there. And in that region of, so the use of mass surveillance is across the country, but particularly in Xinjiang, the language of counterterrorism is definitely being used to impose these systems, and that is has the word terrorism has such wide definition, and I think this is where the abuses start, is that it's not legitimate law enforcement. The very definition of terrorism seems to be so broad that it includes any kind of any efficacy that is construed as criticism of the state is kind of in the bucket of terrorism, such that essentially the entire group of Uyghurs is considered by definition, by the identity as terrorist. And so that's the vague and wide definition leads to all these different kind of human rights violations from the collection and use and storage of data. And in Xinjiang, because terrorism is kind of essentially a catch-all, there is no way for Uyghurs to challenge that collection or the use of data. We would speak with Uyghurs and ask them if there is any way for them to ask some questions about why their DNA is being taken in a mass scale. And they always, people laugh because, I mean, how would they be able to, challenge any of these? So the abuses of human rights is also lies at the inability for people to challenge such collection or use of their data. And then finally, is also once this information is being collected, their use is also directed towards arbitrary detention. So I can elaborate a little bit more, but the collection of biometrics and the tracking of people is central to the Chinese government's detention of Uyghurs in political education camps, which are completely arbitrary. And the impact of these kind of systems are not just about people's privacy. This is where you see in Xinjiang, where people, from how they wear their clothes to what they think in their heads to whether or not they turn on the light in the morning, all are being surveilled. Then they censor themselves from the very beginning in the head. So almost all of the rights are being impacted when people are being surveilled in an intrusive manner, and the use of biometrics is the foundation of such intrusive surveillance because these are immutable characteristics. So I'll just stop there.
Yeah, thank you. No, I mean, the situation right now in Xinjiang is absolutely appalling. And you mentioned the overly broad use of the definition or the broad understanding of terrorism and how there's no legitimate law enforcement. It just encompasses everything and leads to detention. And I was curious, Tommaso, Privacy International recently put out a report with a few wonderful, interesting and insightful case studies that I'll share for everybody they want to read. And you looked at some of these issues from a migration perspective as well. And many of the things that Maya said really resonated with me, and how member state countries use biometrics for counterterrorism purposes at border control, and often, quote unquote, exporting border control to other countries. And this idea of biometrics really being effective when your report has shown that it's not necessarily the case. And could you talk a little bit about your findings, as well as share some of the potential or actual human rights impacts on vulnerable communities such as migrants or refugees and people living in conflict zones?
Yes, thank you very much, and thanks for participating at this event. Yes, as you rightly say, we published recently 3 case studies in relation of the impact of biometric technologies in the context of counter-terrorism measures, and I think. One way of framing it is one of mission creep, which is something that is often mentioned, but it's also often discarded by the proponents of biometric technologies as something that is easily avoidable. While in reality, what we find in our research, not just the 3 case studies, unfortunately, but other examples as well, is that once you introduce the biometric system of control at borders, the system tends to kind of increase in scope and in functions. So you start with the purpose of collection for counterterrorism, as mandated, for example, by the Security Council resolution. It easily moves into areas of migration control, immigration management, immigration enforcement, and leads and is actually supported with this idea of having national biometric ID systems, which basically potentially collect biometric data of individuals, a population at large. So to look at more specifically some of the trends in regards to borders, there's definitely issues around the requirements by security agencies to access travelers' information, including biometrics data, before they leave their countries. The compulsory identification of travelers now must include almost all the time the collection of biometric data, which is very problematic. And as you mentioned, this externalization of border controls, which basically leads to the transfer of technologies by some states with the support of companies for border management to third countries. And we see that this results in supporting biometric traveler screening schemes, for example, with little or no regards to human rights impact assessments. Now, to move a little bit more specifically, to just give you an example of this mission creep, and also to maybe link it a little bit to the issue of population in conflict zone. One of our case studies looked at the development by the US Department of Defense of the biometric program. It was initiated in Iraq and then expanded to Afghanistan. Again, no human rights impact assessment that we are aware of was conducted. And it started to collect biometric data of detainees, security detainees. But very quickly, it expanded to collect biometric data of anyone of some concern. And for the information that we have, it now includes 7.4 million people, mostly people from Iraq and Afghanistan. Most of these people will have no security, will pose no security threats. So it was very difficult to maintain that link to the counter-terrorism purpose that was that how it was initiated. Now this database allows for indefinite storage of the data, and it also allows for interoperability with other databases developed in the US for other purposes. And so again, you see how data collected for one reason expands, but also then are used for different purposes. I'll stop here, but we can talk about some of the other case studies maybe later. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tommaso. And you reiterated points about the mission function creep and how really the use of biometrics goes and is expanded, deployed throughout civic space. It makes me think immediately of the impact of freedom of association and assembly and association, right to protest, and going to Brazil, Paulo. What are your takes on how the use of biometric and counterterrorism has impacted civic space?
Yeah, hello all. Thanks a lot for the invitation and congratulations for the panel. It's a pleasure to be here. I think that in order for us to speak about this, it's interesting to have a kind of a context in terms of what's the situation in Brazil and South America. The thing is that terrorism, it's not a huge threat in the region, right? I mean, the use of violence for political purposes have a bit of a different aspect in South America in relation to the global north. What do we have? It's from the 50s of the 20th century onwards. There has been guerrilla-focused militias, armed struggle with the ideological and political aims, right? And the most notable ones has been the conflict in Colombia between the FARC and the Autodefensas Unidas, the paramilitary group in Colombia, the action of militias in Brazil, the Peruvian Shining Path, but this relates also to national security, right? So, and then there's the creation of the action of the violent actions from the state that uses the justification of these national threats to impose serious violations to human rights. So we have also to remember that there has been in the 60s and 70s up to the early 80s, the whole South American continent was ruled by military regimes, right? And they had system of integration and communications in terms of exchanging information, databases, and so on. So there has been a tradition of repression from the state in terms of, halting this kind of threats from opposition and political groups. And this has been in a certain way accentuated by the coming in of the different technologies of information and communication. So one of the main things that has been going on at the region at this moment is an alliance between this trend of use of biometric technologies, surveillance, monitoring and control with the state action. So we do have examples. We had since 2019, in 2016, Brazil approved an anti-terrorism legislation. And then since 19, there has been more than 20 bills proposing to modify this law. So it's a very difficult task to monitor all of those. And much of them have serious consequences to human rights in terms of freedom of association, freedom of assembly, and also implications in terms of monitoring, surveillance, and using technologies. And because this kind of state policy is connected also with the increment of technologies, and there's a huge influence of big companies and technological industries from the developed world, it became naturalized, this use of biometrics technologies in mostly every space of society. Mainly, we have been seeing in transportation systems, we have been seeing in shopping malls, for example. So the fact that this has become naturalized and the violence serves as justification for the deployment of those technologies, of course, and then we also have this large number of legislation being proposed in terms of control. There has been two mega events in Brazil recently, right? The World Cup in 2014 and the Olympic Games in 2016. And this was also an occasion for the implementation of huge centers of integrated systems of command and control, which has been deployed in various cities in Brazil. So of course, with the justification and the huge inequality that we've seen, there has been serious threats coming from the state in alliance with this technological trend of forming databases, deploying biometric technologies, and this poses a threat without a doubt for principles of freedom of association and assembly and so on. The last thing I would like to notice is that this consequence is seen much more in marginalized communities, particularly racialized communities, and also deploys gender prejudice as well. So I think that this combination between a historical of state violence with the deregulation of new technologies coming from big industries and from abroad, it's an alert for the development of civic spaces in Brazil and in South America. I'll keep it here and then can come back later on. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you for those remarks, Paulo. And you mentioned public transport, sports events, and really give a few examples of how this impacts civic space. And as we're living in a pandemic, many uses of biometrics have been repurposed for emergency purposes. And Maya, I'd love to hear from you, like what are some of your concerns there, or anything you've seen in your work on how the COVID-19 pandemic has been used as an argument or reason to push for more biometrics.
Yeah, thank you. I think that really speaks to what Tommaso was talking about, the mission creep, is that once you have this collection of data, the databases, the systems that are collecting information, then during COVID-19, these systems become then connected to develop contact tracing systems. Like in China, we have this health code, a 3-color code that essentially forces people to be quarantined if they have a red code. And this is based on where they have traveled, their relationships, the history of movements. And, there are a lot of questions about whether or not these systems are arbitrary. How do you challenge them? But at the end of the day, it was built on top of kind of the movement tracking that people never even have a chance to discuss or challenge their use. And what happened then is that it becomes an entrenched practice that become normalized, right? So instead of talking about whether or not these are necessary and proportionate ways of fighting crime or terrorism, it now is become a part of people's lives. And with COVID-19 essentially going to be still affecting much of the world in the next couple of years, these systems will also become entrenched.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely true, unfortunately. And as you mentioned, the difficulty of challenging, any misuse or use, and discussion around necessity and proportionality really brings us to a conversation of how can we best use human rights safeguards to prevent harm. So I'd like to pivot the conversation a little bit and look into, existing regulations, safeguards today, and how can we best protect them, especially as the global counterterrorism strategy is evolving quickly. And turning back to you, Tommaso, what are some of the key challenges that civil society and PI in particular is confronted with when trying to engage with policymakers related to counterterrorism at the UN and beyond in the context of biometrics? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I actually would like to also refer back to the statement, the opening statement by the German, the representative of the Foreign Office of Germany, because I think it's very useful and very enlightening. Is this idea of these two perspectives, security and human rights, that sort of don't speak to each other to some extent. And that is definitely what Privacy International has felt in the context of the counterterrorism policy developments, where there is a difficulty, I would say, for human rights civil society to engage in those developments, both at the national level and at an international UN level. Just to give the example, the most obvious example, resolution 2396 for Privacy International came out of the blue. We had no insight that something like that was coming. And now I understand that the Security Council resolution needs to come up with quite high level, sort of 30,000 feet sort of type of approach. But the introduction of legally binding obligation on all UN member states to develop and share biometric data is very significant human rights implications, as we just discussed. So using qualifiers like responsibly and properly identify terrorists is really not enough to provide guidance on member states to avoid abuse. So at PI, we also turn at some of the publicly available sort of implementation tool that talk about biometrics in counterterrorism context, and obviously the UN compendium of recommendations or recommended practices is an important one, is often quoted. It contains some useful suggestions, but at the same time, again, it makes a very strong case for the use of biometrics. The emphasis is definitely not on human rights safeguards. In particular, it supports integration of biometric databases. It supports interoperability. It supports access of biometric data. It supports all the sort of pitfalls that I was trying to highlight before as a sort of risk for mission creep and eventually for human rights abuses. And I guess it's an example where the lack of involvement of civil society in that compendium led to the development of a compendium that where the voices of the industry, of the biometric industry, is much stronger. So which brings me maybe to my last point, and I know that the Professor Fionnuala Ni Aolain is here, so I won't say much about the role of her mandate, which has been fantastic in developing some of the human rights analysis on biometrics and counterterrorism. But there are other the human rights have developed some safeguards and some standards. I mean, Germany mentioned the resolution on the right to privacy in the digital age. It contains concerns about the use of biometrics. Then you have other special rapporteurs, not just on counterterrorism and human rights, that are looking at issues related to the use of biometrics, like a special rapporteur on contemporary form of racism in relation to borders and the implication for migrants, for example, which I was referring to earlier. So I think we see these developments, but we don't see it reflected in the security debate, and that's where I think we see the challenges in the lack of civil society participation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And +1 on gratitude to the Special Rapporteur for your support for civil society, and we'll have the chance to hear from her later on. But yes, the participating in policymaking is incredibly difficult, and this also makes me think of beyond the UN, there are regulations around the world now to regulate artificial intelligence systems and biometrics, and some regulations have pretty broad prohibitions of some systems, for example, facial recognition, and yet have really broad and large exceptions for issues of counterterrorism, criminal justice, national security, and these sort of become a catch-all exception. So Maya, following up on your presentation before on what's happening in China of the Uyghurs, that essentially, you know, all Uyghurs today are criminals or terrorists in practice, what we're seeing. What are some safeguards that you would like to see implemented in upcoming regulations so that these exceptions do not become essentially an excuse to water down regulation and bans?
Thanks. Of course, in the case of China, I think the answer is really simple. I mean, I think we just need, well, laws and a genuine rule of law that puts in place these principles, necessary and proportionate, right? Like the crime has to be specific. But I think that there are a number of issues. If you look beyond China and in the rest of the world, and if I can venture some guesses into making some recommendations, I think one is that we need to look beyond the terminology of biometrics. If you look at these companies that are developing these systems, they're not just collecting facial images or DNA or these. They are also, for example, tracking IMEI number of your cell phones. They are also using IP addresses on the internet to essentially fuse digital and physical identity and tracking movement. There is also a development, for example, from collecting DNA and then gauging facial images based on that DNA information, relationships between people. So the focus on biometrics is one, but we really need to think about tracking technology in general, and then also about the problem of data integration. So I think it was Paulo who talked about how the sharing of information, integration, they all sound very neutral terms, but it essentially gives state power beyond these legal and regulatory framework that I think often is not addressed by simple bans. And then finally, there's also the issue of I think examining the use of biometrics and proportionality and necessity across the board, not just in terms of different legislation, but also between city and at the federation level, at the national level. What we see is also that in terms of counterterrorism, we're talking about at the government, at the top level, at the federation level. But then at the city level, I think cities are also developing smart cities and safe cities and all of these kind of systems that are not then being evaluated for their human rights impact. So ideally, would like to see an overall evaluation of the role of biometrics and tracking systems across the board in different countries and regulate them as a whole, and looking at the power dynamics and inequality inherent in such systems between the state, companies, and citizens.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I wanted to emphasize your last point on the power imbalance between civil society, private sector, and governments. And we speak about multi-stakeholder collaboration. I think it's critical to begin with that, that statement and that analysis that we come from a situation where there is power imbalances. So thank you for that. And I realize that we're coming up on our last question before opening up to the floor. And so Paulo, if you could finish off this part of the fireside chat with how would you like to see the UN center human rights in its upcoming global counterterrorism strategy, and specifically with an emphasis on AI systems and biometrics?
I got the $1 million question, right? So it's quite difficult nowadays to because of the political environment in many regions and countries are ones who deny the importance of multilateralism, and Brazil is one of those examples. I mean, many special rapporteurs, they showed concern in terms of the new terrorism legislation in Brazil, but this bounces back because the government actually doesn't feel and do not even think about the importance that international dialogue and principles of human rights can deal with. So one of the main things is to reinforce the importance of those mechanisms and make the national governments to understand and go to those tools in order to adequate their legislation to principle of human rights, and maybe more practical stuff, missions of observations are important. But we need, in order to do that, we need to shift the current balance and to understand that the totalitarian and ultra-nationalistic governments needs to understand, and then in this way the whole world needs to make enforcements in terms of the actual mechanism that the the world has in terms of regulating and putting forward human rights principles and even campaigns with policymakers in terms of understanding what human rights impact in deployment of such technologies can represent. I mean, legality, proportionality, and necessity as well, but also, with particular focus on the problems that regions might have in terms of, those technologies, or together with the actions of the state might represent and might violate marginalized groups or the society in general. So, but this is something that needs to be further discussed, and it's not an easy task as well. But we're eager to contribute in national terms of more dialogues and multilateralism in that sense.
Yeah, thank you. Many things that I would like to respond and follow-up questions here, but I'll open the floor to the audience. So feel free to post written questions in the chat. And I see that we already have a few from Margarita and Natalie. Thank you so much for your interest and comments. And I'll start off with one question that you shared directly to Tommaso. I'll read this one. So we at UNOCT are currently discussing the expansion update of the compendium towards a better inclusion of human rights concerns, taking into account the report of the Special Rapporteur issued last July. Indeed, 2396 does not define the meaning of responsible, and it is definitely a priority from the UN side to avoid violation. And Tommaso, what are your reactions to this, I guess, comment more than question, and anything you would like to add?
Thank you. Welcome that there is a process of reviewing it, because as I mentioned, I think issues around the guidelines and integration of human rights is what I think has been lacking. As I said, the report of the Special Rapporteur is very informative in that regard and contains very useful recommendations, which I think should be reflected in any guidance that is given to member states. Maybe I'm going to stop there. I wanted to maybe also raise a separate issues which is more related to the role of companies, but I can do that later. Thank you.
Yeah, that would be great. And Professor Ni Aolain, I saw you also wanted to react to one of Margarita's points.
No, I'm very glad to be here and just to acknowledge the singular importance of having the one and only civil society-led event taking place and being a part of it. Very glad to be part of that in CT Week, and more to say on that. Maybe just to say that I think one of the challenges, so it's clear, and I think Tommaso has already addressed this challenge about the where a compendium or advice to states starts from. And of course, the starting point, not just from a human rights and kind of charter compliant perspective, but also from an effective security perspective, has to be human rights. Human rights isn't an add-on. It's not something you stir into the pot sort of 10 miles down the road and say, oh, whoops, we forgot to add that or didn't do enough of that. The really challenge here is that we don't start in the CT space from the critical, absolute DNA assumption that human rights is at the heart of what we do. Because if we did that, we would be in a very different place. And I think that's a really critical point. The other thing I would say is that, and this really goes to the kind of advice we give states, which is, the best kind of advice is produced through gathering together a diversity of opinion, and in particular, engaging civil society and the users and those who are directly affected by a particular practice into the conversation. And this remains a really significant problem for the UN counterterrorism architecture. At best, civil society gets invited in at the margins. Sometimes they're not invited in at all. Sometimes, like today, they have to push the door themselves with the help of some really supportive states to make their voices really heard. And so I just think it's really critical that if we're going to produce policy that's actually going to be useful to states, that's actually going to avoid, it's not only about kind of starting from human rights at the beginning, not something that gets adds in later, but that actually partnership and listening to civil society and the users and those affected by the use of these technologies has to be in the mix. And regrettably, I don't think we see the kind of evidence of that which would produce the kind of better policy that we need in this arena.
Thank you so much for that comment. And as ECNL, where our mission is to promote and protect civic space, these comments are incredibly welcome. And yes, and I do agree that centering and beginning with a human rights analysis in counterterrorism would prevent many of the misuses we're concerned about today. And Paolo, I think you wanted to respond to the Special Rapporteur.
It's just add something based on what Tommaso and Fionnuala said. They mentioned this. The question of technology and design is quite important, because we have to think having the human rights at the center of every design since the beginning, as a presupposition of every development of technology, means also to change a little bit the political economy of technology, and that means to give the possibility of creation of new technologies, inventions, and innovation to a more broad and diverse range of players, right? I mean, when you have a certain design and a certain ideology of techniques and science and technology, for example, you do have as consequence a particular use of that technology. And then historically, when we have this alliance between the repression of states and also a very biased way of developing technology, of course, we do have as consequences some violations that might come with the design and with the implementation of those technologies. So one of the important things is actually to talk with industrial plants, the manufacturers, designers, and so on, to make it more diverse and broad as possible, so different aspects and different elements can build the technology altogether, instead of just one way of ideological implementing and developing technologies, which actually has consequences for minority groups, of racism, gender prejudice, and so on. So just like to add that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Paolo. And you mentioned at the end, building and developing technologies. And one stakeholder that has been pretty absent from this conversation today is the private sector, who is obviously the primary actor responsible for designing, developing, and often deploying even these technologies through private and public partnerships. And it's perfect timing to end this conversation with also a comment in the chat and a question on what is the role of the private sector. And on one side, how can member states and the UN establish best practices on regulations to constrain and regulate the private sector, while at the same time thinking about soft law, such as the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And I saw a comment on how effective actually is business and human rights today going. Is it impactful or performative? And I think Tommaso, you mentioned before you wanted to raise the issue of the private sector. So if you could share your thoughts there, and then we'll move on to closing arguments. The statement.
Yes, thank you. I will keep it quite briefly. I just wanted to flag the fact that the private sector is indeed central here. A couple of years ago, the High Commissioner for Human Rights mentioned the fact that the capacity of some of the member states to conduct surveillance may even depend on the extent to which business enterprises cooperate with or resist such surveillance. So it's a very, and if you think about it, a lot of member states are actually relying on companies, sometimes companies from countries in the Western world, to actually develop and to run some of the surveillance technologies that they need, they think they need to address counterterrorism. So you have a difficult relationship that needs to be broken. You have a demand by governments, but you also have companies often with very strong links with the government security forces creating such demands and marketing these technical solutions to issues such as counterterrorism or law enforcement, border control, etc. that we have mentioned. So in that context, I think it's very important to look at the public funding of companies, whether it is by the nation states or whether it is by third states that funds companies to carry out programs and support surveillance of other countries. We had, for example, published recently results of our Freedom of Information request with regards to the EU Trust Fund in Africa, which is using some of the money to support the development of mass-scale biometric identity systems in African states by supporting European companies to deliver these systems. And the information we have found is, again, no human rights impact assessment of sort and a significant lack of transparency in the terms of the process of procurement, the process of, and no human rights, as I said, due diligence in that context. So I think looking at this issue of public procurement is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Tommaso, and agree. And from the civil society perspective, we should also do our best to not work in silos and work with other groups focusing on these issues from different lenses, because ultimately, the risk and the impacts are very similar. So thank you for that. And for final part of this session, I'd like to hand it over to the Special Rapporteur.
Thank you very much. I again just want to say how glad I am to be here. I just think it's really important stating, as I said before, this is the singular event we have led by civil society on the margins of this conference. And it speaks to the enormous need. If we think of the wealth of expertise on this panel, it just speaks to the enormous importance of bringing this expertise actually into the counterterrorism space in a meaningful and sustained way. And I also want to acknowledge and really salute the commitment of the Federal Republic of Germany, not only to its commitment to privacy and data protection and to rights in this space, but also to supporting civil society by being a state willing to show up and actively support this kind of conversation. So I think it's just really important. I also want to just start from where the opening remarks came from, which is just to acknowledge the way in which we could think about the security perspective in the context of biometric data collection in the context of CT. And of course, it's important to remember that at least in its most recent and most important iteration, the facilitation of the collection of biometric data in counterterrorism arose in the context of a very specific and narrow Security Council resolution, 2396, a resolution born out of the need to address the phenomenon of foreign terrorist fighters. So again, I just want to note the ways in which something that looks like a very narrow lens, foreign terrorist fighters, if you want a retail problem in international law, by fiat of a Chapter 7 Security Council resolution under paragraph 15 translates into a global legislative requirement to enact biometric data collection. Now, I don't know about everyone else on the call, but I know, for example, that in Ireland, it would be very difficult to get a fiat call for biometric data collection through a national parliament without robust engagement from civil society, from privacy experts, from all kinds of individuals and groups and stakeholders. And I think it's deeply troubling to the integrity of international law and the integrity of our systems of enforcing change in domestic sovereign legal systems to have this kind of enormity come through a Chapter 7 resolution through the kinds of rushed and usually non-transparent and non-open processes that have produced this requirement under Chapter 7. The second thing I want to say in that context is, of course, it came with very little human rights, if you want to call the consistent human rights light approach of regulation in this arena. And in that context, I think it's really important to reflect maybe critically and perhaps a little provocatively on what we mean by and how we assess threat in this arena. Because when we have a global mandate that essentially affects every person traveling by plane, and increasingly we see calls to translate this into maritime and other overland travel, we essentially have a global mandate to collect biometric data on the entire global population, no matter where they move. And that seems to me to be profoundly disproportionate to the stated threat at the end of a particular conflict to address a specific group of people who may be deemed to be traveling and pose risks. And there, I think, the way we think about threat assessment and the proportionality of the measures taken to respond to perceived threat, and it's not that we don't need to respond to that threat, but we have to be really clear-eyed about the burden that's placed on individual, group, and other rights by virtue of a response that mandates essentially a wholesale response to what is a retail problem. I think we also have to ask really hard questions about the scale and continuity of that problem in its current form. And that is not to say that we do not have a problem with foreign terrorist fighters, or that we don't even have a travel problem. But the scale of that problem, commensurate with the scale and density and impact of the measures that are being taken and the normalization of those measures out of counterterrorism into a range of other state practices involving the collection of data, all of which is being accelerated by COVID-19, I think ought to bring us all deep pause. And it has concerned me in particular greatly that one of the patterns that we're seeing in the current moment is that global counterterrorism is offering its tools of surveillance, tracking, data collection, and collection of the most intimate and individual data on the human person as a response to the COVID-19 crisis in the absence of any evidence of sustained implementation of human rights protections in the context in which these data are already being used. Second, let me close by saying that I remain deeply concerned about the discriminatory aspect of the use of many of these technologies. And my colleague, Tendai Achume, Special Rapporteur Racism, has pointed out that the production of these technologies happens in primarily white male spaces in Silicon Valley that are exported to populations who are vulnerable, marginalized, and excluded around the world. And I think that, again, should give us extraordinary pause about the way in which the tech fix here has been systematically immune to human rights and to human rights mainstreaming, and is, in a sense, an island outside of the realm of human rights. Again, something to give us pause. And let me also, thirdly, then, reflect on mission creep, the normalization of the exceptionality of collecting the most intimate data on the human person across the globe. Those of us who've had long experiences of the abuses that we're seeing in the counterterrorism space and the abuse of CT systematically against civil society, minorities, and others understand profoundly that the idea that this will be contained is already irrelevant, because it's not. And it is being systematically used against populations who are merely defending their rights under international law to speak, to assemble, to practice their religious beliefs, to engage in public affairs. And again, that speaks to not a simple solution of updating guidance or giving new advice to states, but a fundamental rethink about what it means to use these technologies in the counterterrorism arena. And with that, I'll close and thank you all for joining this event and commend these extraordinary NGOs who are doing such amazing work. The kind of documentation that we're seeing today being done in every part of the globe on these kinds of technologies is thanks to the folks who are on this call today, and we should all be deeply in their debt. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Special Rapporteur. Words mean a lot, like I said, and I won't reiterate everything you said because these were perfectly closing arguments, just highlight again what we've heard today about the function creep of these technologies, the fact that they are being normalized, increased, and the people who bear the brunt of harm are usually those who work to expose them. And yeah, today during our COVID-19, 1.5 years almost into COVID-19, we really have seen how these technologies have been repurposed for emergency measures. And thank you all so much to everybody here who not only spent today talking about their findings, but like you said, Special Rapporteur, have been fighting hardly under very limited resources to expose these risks and impacts. So thank you to the panelists, thank you to my co-organizers, Privacy International, Human Rights Watch, ECNL, and Article 19. And this really was a coalition event. So all the organizations present today, including ECNL, are part of a coalition working on human rights and counterterrorism. That was also very much encouraged by the Special Rapporteur and supported. And so really wanted to give a small shout out to all the members of the coalition. And finally, thank you, Special Rapporteur. Thank you, Mr. Heinze, for presenting Germany today. We really need the support of institutional and member state representatives. And hopefully next year, if there is a third virtual counterterrorism week, this can be a formal side event or formally part of the agenda. So working to make that happen. And thank you to all the attendees who took time to listen to this conversation on a Thursday morning or evening, wherever you are in the world. Not the easiest topic, so we appreciate you all and are available if you ever want to reach out to any of us or colleagues at our organizations. Thank you so much. See you all soon.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a
Bye.
good day.